Morning, welcome. You're watching Bloomberg UK. I'm Guy Johnson in London. Let's talk a little bit about what comes next. We are approaching the general election. Obviously, funding is a key part of that story. And we are certainly seeing maybe a few of the big funders of the Conservative Party in the past maybe thinking about taking a different direction. One of those potentially is the British billionaire and founder of Phones for You, John Caudwell, one of the Conservative Party's biggest individual donors over the last few years. Recently, though, a little bit more critical of the government and in particular the record it has delivered on boosting investment. A report this week that he commissioned actually says that Britain is one of the only major economies without a proper industrial strategy and continues to suffer from a chronic and short-term approach to funding of innovation. He's been lobbying and has been certainly upping his efforts and calls for the government to create an environmental tech-led enterprise zone in the UK. John Caudwell joins us now. John, welcome to Bloomberg. Thanks for the time this morning. Look, the story over the last couple of days is that you would be willing maybe to switch allegiances, that if we see a big majority maybe for the Labour Party at the upcoming general election, and if the Labour Party delivers a bold industrial policy going forward, you would back that. So let's maybe get into that a little bit further. What does a bold industrial policy look like, and what do you want to see Labour delivering were it to win the election?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a lot of synergies between a very successful business and a successful country. And we need to be run more in a commercial way rather than a political way. Commercial means, how do we grow the economy of the UK? How do we put the great back in Britain? How do we become attractive to inward investors? And there's many methodologies for that, but we need high technology inward investors to bring technology to Britain, to grow high-paid jobs, to grow exports, both in product and intellectual property all over the world. And the best way of doing this, in my opinion, is the environment, because the environment is under such colossal threat. And even those people that may not believe an apocalypse is coming down the road, they may not believe it now. I can assure you, over the next few years, as more and more local devastating events occur, people are going to realize that a global apocalypse is coming down the road. And therefore, investment in the environment in general, in climate change, is a monstrous investment that will be exportable all over the world. And I want Britain to be at the forefront of that.
So what does that mean? Does that mean an active industrial policy? Is that what you would like to see here, akin to what we've seen maybe in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, we've just done a study called Caudwell Strong Britain, which highlight 10 points of improvement. And that ranges from science and technology strategies right the way through to improving universities, to growing our talent pool of people. But the number one thing that we can do above and beyond everything else is set forward a specialized tax regime for inward investment in high-tech companies. We need to be the Silicon Valley for the environment. Now, whether that's a local area that we set up or whether it's just a virtual network doesn't really matter. It would be great if it was everybody all in one designated zone, but the zone could just be virtual. And what I would do if I were running the country, I would have a group of businessmen who were interviewing potential applicants for this special enterprise zone. They'd want to be part of it because they were to have very, very attractive tax breaks, and there'd be other investment opportunities as well, from both from government and from a third-party fund. So everything would be put into place to attract inward investment and help that inward investment grow, prosper, and produce cutting-edge technologies in the scientific and technological space, but really specialized on the environment, because that is where the desperate need is really going to come from.
Why? I appreciate what you say about what is happening with the climate, but do you think that would be the best use of resources, or do you think a focus maybe on technology like AI? The UK has significant leadership, you could argue, in the latter. Does it have sufficient critical mass in the former to justify the investment you're talking about?
Well, first of all, of course, within my technological advancements, I am talking about AI. I'm talking about anything that is high tech, highly scientific, that produces great results. And AI, of course, as we all know, is phenomenally exciting for the future. Only this morning, I joined a new AI platform, and I put into it, and it creates videos. And I put into that platform how to make Britain great through tax breaks and through making Britain a very attractive inward investment environment. It produced the most amazing video. I mean, it wouldn't be the finished product. I would have to tailor it a little bit, but I was actually immensely impressed. And this is the speed that AI is coming to us at, and it's almost frighteningly fast. So, of course, my technological inward investment ideas, of course, they include AI, growing all technological aspects. But the environment is the big one, because if we don't do that, we're going to be in such a horrendous mess going forward. And this is Britain's opportunity to be right at the forefront of that. I was very disappointed when Rishi went backwards by making 2030, 2035. That was a really negative step, because at least in showing Europe and the rest of the world the pathway to net zero, we advanced by 5 years on most of the rest of the world, and then changed their mind. And that really was, for me, catastrophically wrong.
If the Labour Party were to deliver something akin to what you've just described, would that be something that you would be prepared to back? I.e., would you, and I'm talking here about backing the Labour Party, there's been obviously significant interest over the last few days in potentially you making that switch. If we see a big majority for Labour, Labour does what you're describing, we get the political stability that many in business certainly crave at the moment, would that be something that you would be prepared to get behind in terms of your funding of political parties? I.e., would you be prepared to back the Labour Party if it delivered that?
Well, I've always made it very, very clear that I would back any party that I believe does the right things commercially for Britain to grow Britain's GDP per capita, and to therefore be able to use all that extra tax revenue to make people's lives better, especially those that are really at the moment deprived at the bottom end of the scale. So I've always made that really clear. I have been a lifelong Tory supporter, because the policies of the Tory party have always been the ones that I believed in, that would make Britain the strongest it could be. That said, over the last few years, I've been very disappointed in the Tory party performance. I don't see anything that is helping us to put the great back into Britain. When we look at the GDP per capita from pre-2008, we're no further advanced now. And it's not all about just producing commercial growth, but if you don't produce commercial growth, you can't look after the poorer people of society. You can't invest in the health service, in the schools, and in those people that desperately need social services for whatever reason. And as a humanitarian, I desperately want those people to be invested in, but I want to do it through capitalism and low tax to drive Britain forward and make it extremely attractive to inward investors. So in answer to your question, that was a long answer, I will support whoever puts in the right commercial policies to be great. I'm not interested in politics per se, which is the tweaking and messing about with certain things. Like, for instance, I'm not a fan of what Labour are talking about now, putting VAT on private schools. I don't think it makes commercial sense. I think it'll starve people out of the private sector of school, put them into state schools. I don't believe it'll be a net revenue generator. It'll do damage to private schools, and it'll make some parents' lives very difficult. That is not a policy that's good for Britain, in my belief. Okay. But if Labour policies in...
John, just very briefly, because I'm slightly running out of time, can I just ask you a quick question on one policy that I hear continuously from British business leaders? They would like to see the UK rejoining the customs union, and we've already seen the impact. You talk about what is happening with net zero, the impact potentially on the car sector as a result of being able to access batteries and a wider market. Do you think it would make sense, given what we see, given the challenges and the scale required to deliver, particularly on the climate, do you think it would make sense for the UK now to reconsider its membership of the customs union?
Well, I think first of all, we've had a real struggle post-Brexit to make everything work. And I don't think we've seen the full benefits of Brexit yet. What we've seen is the negatives. What I'm talking about here is operating outside of the EU in a way that really competes dramatically with the EU to bring in investment. I don't think being part of that club is necessary. But let me give another example of some of the negativity I have about the EU. When we look at the aid for Ukraine held up by Hungary, a Putin supporter, I think that's disgraceful that that club of the EU can be held up from doing what is clearly right in the vast majority of the EU opinion, can be held up, and those poor Ukrainian people have been fighting with lack of ammunition because of Hungary. And that is just completely unacceptable in an EU constitution. So for me to want to be part of that EU, the constitution would have to be changed dramatically.
John, thank you very much indeed. I understand you're going to be getting on your bicycle now. We wish you good luck with that ride. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us. The UK entrepreneur and founder of Phones for You. That, of course, was John Caudwell. Coming up next, we are going to be hearing from a former BP CEO, Lord John Browne. We're going to be hearing about how he views the upcoming election. That's next. This is Bloomberg. So, the former BP CEO, John Browne, one of the first CEOs of a major oil company to link greenhouse gas emissions to global warming. He caught up with Francine to talk about the future of climate investment in the UK and how it factors, he thinks, into the upcoming general election. Take a listen.
I think climate should have a vote, a big vote. And one of the tests that I would apply to any party contesting the general election is, what are they going to do about climate? What are they going to do? Clearly, you could look at the UK and say, what an irrelevant country. 1% or less of global emissions, so does that matter? The answer is yes, it does, because the innovation in this country, which has been long-standing, needs to be revived and produce the technologies and the processes to get climate change under control. And we should be doing it here. We should absolutely be doing it here, and we can. So I'd be testing that, see how we can do that, how we can readjust investment to get that done. And I think there are ways of just doing that. So
how would you do it? Because there were pledges, 28 billion, they were retracted. It's the hardest fiscal kind of conundrum that the UK has gone through in 70 years. So do you need to find the money? Yes, you do. There are three things you've got to do. One, I think you've got to, first you've got to worry about how much is public money and how much is private money. Public money, including tax release, that's also public money, needs to come from first focusing what we're doing. I think we're trying to do too many things across the board, well-meaning, but don't move the needle. So I expect there's some money to come out of that. Secondly, there's clearly money to come out of asking ourselves, what are we doing in the oil and gas sector? Should we be carrying on as we're carrying on? And the answer is probably not. And we could save some tax relief long term in that. And thirdly, we have to worry about what are the things that we've dedicated money to that probably don't need to be done just yet. And one of which, for example, is the huge amount of money which could be spent in the abandonment of oil and gas facilities. We could defer, change that. So I'm all in favour of finding ways to get the money, but more importantly, to dedicate that money to the development of non-hydrocarbon sources of energy. What do you think the election will be fought on? The economy? Without any doubt. In the end, all elections have a lot of what's in my purse or my wallet as part of the features. I think there are so many things being sprayed around at the moment that I'm sort of stepping back and saying,
In the end, I think people will want competence. They'll want change. I mean, inevitably, people look for change, and I think they want to have a sense that the country has a strong future. In other words, it could grow properly. For my book, a lot of that's got to be in science and technology, and a lot of that has to be in climate.
Does the UK need its own Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, it could, but the thing about the Inflation Reduction Act is you have to be a very wealthy country to be able to put such a piece of legislation in place. It is open-ended. There's a lot of money involved here, which the US can afford to do, and the UK probably can't. It's a big gamble on putting a lot of state money behind something that could get private money and grow. We can do some of that. And the UK has been very successful in things like incentives for wind, the so-called contracts for difference. Very clever idea of making sure there's a floor, and making sure there is a ceiling, which people don't get too much of a windfall. So this is not a bad way of doing things. So the UK needs to revive its creativity, and it does have creativity, to go forward in this area.
There's also talk of Total of France, but also Shell here in the UK, listed in the UK, of looking to possibly list in New York because the capital markets is more friendly to oil companies.
I think people have been at this for a long time. Even I was, thinking the multiples are different, but in the end there are so many things you've got to get right to move, including getting a very large supermajority of your shareholders to approve it, that you don't. I think that equity markets are becoming more and more global, so there's less of a reliance on local markets. Local markets are much more for debt and for derivatives, things like this. And I think the equity markets become much more global, helped not least by people like Bloomberg.
So did you at the time actually look at possibly delisting and listing in New York,
or
yes, was it fanciful?
No, we were looking at all these things, because the majority of the company, when I was CEO, was in America. And actually we realized that after a few years that about 5% of the company was in the UK, and we were listed in the United Kingdom. Now, we had a very good American Depository Receipts program in the US, and a lot of good US shareholders. And you have to really work with the US to get these shareholders. Performance matters.
But so what you're saying is that it doesn't really make sense. So Shell shouldn't stay here because it's attached to the UK. It makes little business sense to move.
It makes, people are quoted by historical accident in some ways. The BP was quoted here because, of course, it was a state company for many years. Shell was quoted here and in Amsterdam, and then concluded that here would be the right place to quote. But these things will sort themselves out, provided your shareholders agree with you. If they're ready to get you to move listing, they'll vote for you. If they won't, they'll stop it.
Lord Browne talking to Francine, of course, the former BP CEO, chairman now of BeyondNetZero. That's a climate venture from General Atlantic. What are we going to do next? We want to talk about what the tax change could look like under a Labour government, and how people maybe are going to start rejigging their finances, already are rejigging their finances as a result of that. What's a safe asset going into a Labour government? We're going to discuss that next with John Stepek. This is Bloomberg. Britain's rich racing to protect their wealth ahead of the election, ahead of an election hit. That's the story on the Bloomberg terminal this morning. Are they right to be worried? Let's find out. John Stepek standing next to me. John, what do you think?
Yes. I think that it's reasonable to be worried, and if you have the means to organise your affairs in such a way that you can leave the UK or protect your wealth, then it probably does.
Okay, that's two different things. Okay,
yes.
So staying in the UK and protecting your wealth, what are people worried about in terms of how Labour policy could impact wealth if you stay?
Well, I suppose neither party's been terribly honest about the fact that we're going to have to put taxes up. Yeah, exactly. Nobody's going to want to do that ahead of an election. But the fact is, the national balance sheet is not in great condition. Both parties have made quite a big meal of the state of the national balance sheet because of what happened with Liz Truss.
Yeah.
So even though we actually probably do have more breathing room than they would like to acknowledge, they're not admitting that. And so that means that taxes are going to have to go up. And the problem is they keep ruling out all the big taxes. And so everyone's sort of racking their brains thinking, well, where might this come from? And for example, for your personal finances, the pension is an obvious one.
Inheritance tax.
Inheritance tax is another obvious one. There's even been talk about possibly looking at the taxation of ISAs. ISAs are another big kind of savings thing in the UK. That one seems like an outside event, but at the same time, a major think tank executive is now running for the Labour Party, and he had talked about taxing on ISAs.
Just in 20 seconds, the non-dom numbers have been falling pretty rapidly already. How much is that going to accelerate? Almost certainly going to accelerate after the Labour government comes into power, if it were to see that?
Well, certainly my colleagues in the wealth team have been talking to advisors, and while they want to be off the record, a lot of them saying that people are worried about it. It's partly because it's an attitude thing, VAT in private schools, and it's an inheritance tax thing.
Okay. John, great to see you. Thanks very much indeed. Be sure to subscribe to John's daily newsletter, Money Distilled. This is Bloomberg.